The Whispering Woods. I don't talk about this much, honestly. I've spent years convincing myself it was just a nightmare. But the truth is, it wasn't. I was there. It happened. And no matter how many times I try to rationalize it, I know what I saw. It started when my friend Dan insisted we go camping. He'd been hyped about some isolated spot in the woods a few hours outside town. No people, no noise, just us and nature, he said. Sounded good. After a tough few months at work, I figured a weekend away might clear my head. We left on a Friday afternoon, driving up winding roads until the pavement gave way to gravel. Dan had a hand-drawn map from some old local guy he'd met. He said it's the most untouched place you'll ever see, Dan bragged as he navigated. When we finally arrived, it was eerie. No sounds of animals or rustling leaves, just this heavy silence hanging in the air. The trees were unnaturally tall, their gnarled branches twisting like skeletal fingers against the darkening sky. But Dan didn't seem to notice. He was too busy setting up the tent and starting a fire. The first night was uneventful. We drank a few beers, swapped stories, and laughed until the fire died down. Around midnight, I crawled into my sleeping bag, the cool air and exhaustion pulling me into a deep sleep. That's when I heard it. A faint whispering. At first, I thought it was the wind, but the sound didn't drift. It was steady, persistent, like voices murmuring just beyond comprehension. I opened my eyes, staring at the roof of the tent, my heart pounding. Dan was snoring next to me, oblivious. "Dan," I hissed, shaking his shoulder. He groaned and rolled over. "Do you hear that?" "Hear what?" he mumbled, half asleep. I froze, listening. The whispers had stopped. "Forget it," I muttered, convincing myself it was my imagination. The next day we explored the woods. Dan was thrilled, snapping pictures and making jokes. But I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Every so often I'd catch movement out of the corner of my eye, a shadow darting between the trees or a shape lingering too long in the distance. But whenever I turned, nothing was there. By evening, the unease had settled into my bones. I wanted to leave, but Dan wouldn't hear of it. "One more night," he insisted, throwing another log onto the fire. "Come on, man, you're just spooked." That night, the whispers came back. This time they were louder. They didn't stop when I opened my eyes. They didn't stop when I sat up, clutching my flashlight like a lifeline. The voices were circling the tent, moving closer, faster. I unzipped the tent and stepped outside, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. "Who's there?" I shouted, my voice cracking. The forest swallowed my words, the whispers growing more frantic. Then, I saw it. A figure stood at the edge of the clearing, just barely illuminated by the firelight. It was tall, impossibly thin, with limbs that seemed to stretch too far, bending at unnatural angles. Its head cocked to one side as if studying me. "Dan!" I screamed, backing up into the tent. "Dan, wake up!" Dan stumbled out, rubbing his eyes. "What's your problem?" I pointed to where the figure had been. It was gone. "There was someone there," I stammered. "Something." Dan laughed, though his face was pale. "You're losing it, man." But I wasn't. I knew what I saw. The rest of the night we stayed by the fire, too scared to sleep. The whispers never stopped. They swirled around us, louder and louder, until it felt like they were inside my skull. Dan sat rigid, gripping his flashlight, his confidence from earlier completely gone. When dawn finally broke, we packed up and left without a word. The drive back was silent. Dan kept glancing at me like he wanted to say something, but he never did. I thought that would be the end of it. But the whispers followed me. At first they were faint, only coming at night when I was alone. But they grew stronger, louder, until I couldn't ignore them. I started seeing that figure, at the edge of the woods near my house, reflected in windows, lurking in my dreams. Dan stopped answering my calls. Last I heard, he moved out of state. I don't blame him. I've spent years trying to forget, trying to convince myself it was just a bad trip, sleep deprivation, anything. But every so often I hear them again, the whispers, and I know it's watching. It's always watching. A cabin in the woods. I never thought my weekend getaway would end like this. Alone, in the middle of nowhere, with the kind of fear that makes your skin crawl. But I should start at the beginning, shouldn't I? I'm James, 34, workaholic, tired of the grind. When my buddy Eric suggested a weekend at a cabin his family owned deep in the Appalachian woods, I jumped at the chance. Off the grid, he'd said. No Wi-Fi, no neighbors, just nature and a cooler full of beer. Exactly what I needed. The drive there was uneventful. Long, winding roads flanked by thick forests, the occasional deer darting across the road. By the time I pulled up to the cabin, the sun was setting, casting long shadows over the trees. The place was rustic but charming. A single-story wooden cabin with a small porch and a fire pit out front. Eric had been delayed by work, but assured me he'd arrive by morning. "Enjoy the solitude," he texted. "There's a generator for lights, but don't drain it all at once." I didn't think much of it. The first couple of hours were peaceful. I lit a fire, cracked open a beer, and leaned back in an old, creaky chair on the porch. The forest was alive with the sounds of crickets and the occasional hoot of an owl. It was perfect. Until it wasn't. It started with the silence, not gradual, sudden. One moment, the forest was alive with sound. The next, it was like someone had hit the mute button. No crickets, no owls, nothing. Just the sound of my own breathing. I tried to shrug it off. Nature's weird sometimes, right? Animals sense predators, maybe a bobcat or something. But as the minutes ticked by, an unease settled over me. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I told myself to get over it. I went inside, locked the door, and turned on a single lamp powered by the generator. The warm glow filled the room, but it didn't help much. Shadows seemed to stretch and shift in the corners of my vision, but when I looked directly at them, there was nothing there. Around midnight, I heard it. A knock. 3 slow, deliberate knocks on the front door. My heart stopped. Who the hell would be out here in the middle of nowhere? Eric wasn't supposed to arrive until the morning. Maybe he came early. But no, he'd have called. "Eric?" I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. No answer, just the creak of the porch boards as someone, or something, shifted its weight. I grabbed the closest thing to a weapon I could find, a heavy iron poker from the fireplace, and approached the door. My heart was pounding so loudly I could barely hear myself think. "Who's there?" I shouted. Nothing. I threw the door open, poker raised, ready to swing. The porch was empty. I stepped out, looking around, my breath visible in the cold night air. The forest loomed around me, dark and endless. And then I saw them, footprints in the dirt, leading from the woods to the porch. Bare footprints. They stopped just short of the door. I felt a chill run down my spine. Whoever or whatever had knocked was gone. But where? I hurried back inside, bolting the door and closing all the curtains. I tried to tell myself it was just some local messing with me. Kids playing a prank. But deep down, I didn't believe that. I didn't sleep much that night. Every creak of the cabin made me jump. Every gust of wind sounded like whispering. At some point, I must have dozed off because I woke to the sound of my phone buzzing. It was Eric. "Hey man, change of plans," he said. "I won't make it until tomorrow afternoon, got tied up at work." I stared at the phone, my mouth dry. "Wait," I said. "You weren't here last night?" "What? Number Y?" I didn't answer. My mind was racing. That's when I noticed it. The footprints. They were back. But this time, they weren't just on the porch. They were inside, leading from the front door to where I was standing. I turned around slowly, poker still in hand. My eyes scanned the room, but I saw nothing. No movement, no sound. But the footprints, they were fresh, still damp with mud. And then I heard it. A whisper, right behind me. "Leave." I spun around, swinging the poker wildly. There was no one there. I ran out of that cabin so fast I don't even remember grabbing my keys. I drove through the night, the forest closing in on me, the shadows outside my car feeling like they were alive. I haven't been back since. Eric told me later that his family sold the cabin years ago, that it had been abandoned ever since. So who, or what, was in there with me that night? I don't know. And I don't want to. But sometimes late at night I hear those knocks. Slow, deliberate. 3 knocks. Always 3. The Watcher in the Woods. It started with a cabin. A perfect getaway, or so I thought. A friend of mine, Eric, had come across a deal too good to pass up. A small secluded cabin deep in the Appalachian Mountains. "You need a break, man," he'd said. "Disconnect for a few days. No work, no emails, no distractions." And honestly, after months of grinding through deadlines, it sounded like heaven. When I arrived, the place looked exactly as described, rustic but cozy. The nearest neighbor was miles away. The air was crisp and clean, and the trees stood like silent sentinels around the property. I unpacked, lit a fire, and poured myself a drink. The first evening was uneventful, peaceful even. I watched the sun sink behind the trees and marveled at how quiet it was. No cars, no voices, just the hum of the forest. But then night fell. The first thing I noticed was the absence of sound. No crickets, no rustling leaves, nothing. Just silence so profound it felt unnatural. I chalked it up to my city-dulled senses and went to bed. But sleep didn't come easily. I kept feeling like something was off. I told myself it was just the unfamiliar setting, but I couldn't shake the unease. Around 2 a.m., I heard it, a faint tapping on the window. My stomach tightened. The cabin had 2 windows, one in the living room and one in the bedroom where I lay. The tapping was coming from the bedroom window. It could be an animal, I told myself. A branch, maybe. The wind. Anything but. Anyone. I turned on the bedside lamp, trying to act braver than I felt. The light spilled across the room, and the tapping stopped. Slowly, I crept toward the window, heart pounding, my breath shallow. The curtains were thick, drawn tightly shut. With trembling fingers, I pulled them back. Nothing. Just my own reflection staring back at me. Relieved but still uneasy, I returned to bed. Minutes later, the tapping started again, louder this time. I froze. My mind raced through every possibility, none of them comforting. For a moment, I considered packing up and leaving, but where would I go? It was pitch black outside, and the winding mountain roads were treacherous even in daylight. The tapping continued, steady and deliberate. And then I heard a voice, a whisper so faint I wasn't sure if it was real. "Let me in." I bolted upright, my blood running cold. Someone was out there. I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight. Peering out into the darkness, I scanned the tree line. Nothing. No movement. No sign of life. But the voice had been clear. It wasn't my imagination. I stayed awake the rest of the night, the lamp on, my ears straining for any sound. Morning couldn't come fast enough. The next day, I explored the area around the cabin, hoping to find some logical explanation. A loose branch, an animal trail, something. But the ground was undisturbed, no tracks, no signs of wildlife. Still, I convinced myself it had to be nothing. Maybe the isolation was getting to me. That night the silence returned, and with it, the tapping. This time it moved, from the bedroom window to the living room. It was as if something was circling the cabin, testing my defenses. I didn't pull back the curtains this time. I didn't want to know what was out there. Instead, I barricaded the doors with furniture and sat in the corner of the living room, clutching a kitchen knife. The whisper came again, clearer this time. "Let me in." The voice was wrong, too low, too guttural. It didn't sound human. I shouted, "Go away!" My voice cracked, betraying my fear. Silence. And then, laughter. Low and raspy, like the sound of dry leaves being crushed underfoot. It came from all around me, as if the walls themselves were mocking me. My heart thundered in my chest as the lights began to flicker. The cabin, so inviting in the daylight, now felt like a trap. And then I saw it. A shadow. darker than the night, standing just beyond the window. It didn't have a face, not really, but I could feel its eyes on me, heavy and piercing. The thing didn't move, just stood there, watching. I don't know how long I stayed like that, frozen in place, knife in hand, staring back at whatever it was. Eventually, the lights stopped flickering, and the shadow melted into the darkness. But I knew it hadn't left. It was waiting. By dawn, I'd had enough. I threw my things into the car and drove, not caring where I was going as long as it was away from that cabin. The whole way down the mountain, I felt like I was being watched. Every so often, I'd glance in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something in the back seat. I didn't stop driving until I reached the nearest town. Exhausted, I stumbled into a diner, desperate for coffee and company. The waitress took one look at me and frowned. "You all right, hun? You look like you've seen a ghost." I hesitated, then told her everything. She listened quietly, her expression growing more serious with every word. When I finished, she leaned in close and whispered, "You're lucky you left. That cabin's been empty for years. The last guy who stayed there, well, they never found him." I felt the blood drain from my face. "What do you mean?" She shrugged, looking uncomfortable. "Locals say the woods around there aren't normal. People hear things, see things. They call it the Watcher, something that doesn't want you there." I left the diner without finishing my coffee. To this day, I don't know what I saw, or almost saw, at that cabin, but I've never gone back, and I never will. Sometimes late at night I still hear that voice in my head. "Let me in.